So I left the big city of Washington and came back down here where I felt a little more comfortable to set up a new business. Now, I had never been in business. I knew absolutely nothing about business. I bought a paperback textbook on accounting, some bookkeeping, at the airport somewhere, and studied that. So I learned all about bookkeeping that way. Came down here and hired a Catholic nun part-time as my secretary. She had to get a job to support her cat. The convent wouldn't support her cat. So she was looking for a job, and that worked out fine. But I needed some clients. And the first client I thought of was one B. Calvin Burns, a land developer of Chincoteague, Virginia. Now, Cal was at one of the coastal zone meetings that we had. Skipped a big bunch. When I was with the federal government, and we had put on a bunch of scientists who talked about all these ecological values of estuaries and marshes. Finally, Cal got up there, and he said, "Gentlemen, money is the name of the game, and if you think it's anything else, you're kidding yourself." And that was about his whole speech. Well, Cal had a real nice development over on Captain's Cove, it was called, on Chincoteague, on the mainland. And he wanted me to, we had a little session and had a drink. Turned out I didn't have any money to pay for the drink, so Cal had to pay for the drink. But he had this development, and he wanted me to do an ecological appraisal for him, so it was fine. So I looked at it, and it was really beautiful. Rolling country coming down into the bay. Good soils, good drainage, some agricultural land, no forest values to be worried about. But he had a big piece of salt marsh down there, tidal marsh, and he had advertised that this was all waterfront, canal front property that he was going to sell down there. So I went through all my spiel about it, and I said, but in terms of this canal front property, I doubt that you'll be able to do that, because you need, at that time, just section 10 permits, and the Corps is simply not giving those for that kind of operation. Cal says, "Thank you for the report," and he started. Whereupon, of course, he got nailed by the Corps for section 10, so he couldn't continue with that. And then he got nailed by HUD on the Interstate Land Sale Act, where anybody over 50 lots or more, something like that, had to file all these documents with HUD. And he'd filed documents saying he was going to have canal front lots, which of course he didn't have, so that was fraud. So Cal was in trouble there. But that was my first client, yeah. Good experience. A little later on, Cal came back to me. He had a little trouble over on the island. Something about this section 404 thing and wetlands. And they were objecting to him making a little trailer development over there on Chincoteague Island. So I went up to look at that. And lo and sure, he'd filled in a whole bunch of Payton's marsh over there. And we went to court. And we had discovery hearings, proceedings with the federal attorneys from EPA. And they had Bill Sipple, who has since become quite well known as a wetland expert with EPA, as their expert. And I went into there, and they asked me what I found. And I said, well, I found a number of discrepancies in the government's evidence here. For instance, they weren't going in the right direction out there that they said they were in, and they really have no way of determining what happened out there. And my interest, other than earning an honest living, was that at that time there were no regulations, there was no guidelines. Yeah. A person's wetland was what the person said was the wetland, and it was. I was more concerned with equal protection than anything else in the case. And they said, well, what would you have done, Dr. Adams? And I said, well, what I would have done was to get some before and after aerial photos and plot out what those areas were, and then get some ground truth and show the profiles and the soils and be able to determine just how much was filled in. Government called for a recess for a little while. And they came in with 4 foot by 4 foot aerial photos that the defense had never seen. So of course the defense attorney went through overhead about that. Well, that case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I thought, man, this is going to be a real chance to make some good resource law here in terms of equal protection. The Supreme Court remanded it back to the lower courts because the defendant didn't get a jury trial. And the Constitution provides that in matters over $25, the defendant is entitled to a jury trial. It had nothing to do with equal protection, wetlands, nothing.
Yeah.
Little legal quirk in there. But there were a number of those little incidents in the consulting business. Another one was with Signal Properties on the West Coast. I got a call from somebody out there. Signal Oil Company had pumped all the oil out of this Bolsa Chica Lagoon area. And now they were going to turn it into lagoon property. So I went out there and I looked at it. Beautiful, high salt marsh, disticless saltworks, alicornia, stuffed ponds with avocets and stilts and cinnamon teal. Somewhere along the line, one of the executives from Signal Properties said, "You don't seem to understand, Dr. Adams." And I said, "What do you mean?" "You don't seem to understand what your role in this is." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the way we view it, said, your role is like an attorney. Said, you're to defend the client at all costs." And I said, "Well, that's not the way I see it. The way I see it is that I'm to give you the best professional counsel that I can, regardless of what your objectives are. You make the decisions, but I don't bend or twist any of my findings to fit your decisions." Well, that's the only job in all my consulting that I never got paid for. They paid me for my airfare to West Coast, but they never paid me for my time. And that project never was built. So if they'd listened, it would have been much better. Well, that went on for several years, and things began to get a little tight in the middle 70s. And I was having to lay off people and didn't much care for that. And Art Cooper was Assistant Secretary for Natural Resources at that time, under Jim Harrington was the director. And Cooper was my major professor on a PhD. So he came down and talked a little while, and next thing I knew, I was Assistant Secretary, and Cooper was back on campus. He had taken his 5 years off and had to decide whether he was going to make a career out of bureaucracy or a career out of academia, so he went back to campus. And I went in there at the tail end of the Holzhauser's, who was the governor.
Yeah, he was a good one. And Art's big accomplishment was the coastal zone management.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was in that seat in the early 70s when all of this legislation was going through.
Right.
And I was out of the state business. I was involved to some degree at the federal level, but not down here. So right at the tail end of one administration, little naive, dumb Dave again goes into the bureaucracy, and his administration changed. I survived. So then I was Assistant Secretary. The secretary was Howard Lee from Orange County, who subsequently became a senator. And Howard Lee and I had a little difference in philosophy, which finally ended in just giving me 2 weeks to get out of there. And I did. The only time in my whole career that I've had to go look for a job. And I can sympathize just a little bit with those people that are unemployed, because that was an awfully insecure kind of feeling for someone that there was always a job waiting for me up till then. Somebody was coming to me. Now I had to go to them, and I just didn't like that. But again, happened so as luck would have it. 4 people out at state: Art Cooper, Jay Langfelder, AC Barefoot, and years. I can't remember the other one. Yeah,
The same problem.
yeah, he was director of water resources at state.
Oh,
Briggs, Neil, any rate, we'll call him Neil. Yeah. Put together a Save Dave Adams sort of slush fund and created out of whole cloth a place for me to hide out there at state, which I did. Shortly thereafter, Neil became assistant secretary. He didn't last very long, and after him, Langfelder became assistant secretary. So of this group, Cooper was assistant secretary, I was, Neil was, Langfelder was, AC was the only one that didn't make it, but none of us made it very long. So I ended up out there at school then and started teaching, and put together 2 courses, one a practicum in environmental assessment, in which we tried to run a job just as one would in a consulting firm, just taking whatever I got of graduate students and putting them out in the field to do it. And that was a good experience. I had good kids, and was, sort of feeling your way along. And the other major job was in teaching natural resource policy, which I did from a legal administrative, not an economic standpoint. Then finally got a textbook written, got it published after 26 publishing companies and 2 contracts. Island Press picked it up. That was published in '92, I think. As of last year, it was still being used at Michigan State. And I wrote the fellow's name down, and I've forgotten now what it was. But he wrote me, or he wrote the publisher here a couple of years ago, and said, "I've been using this book for some time. It's a good book, but who's Adams?" I like to let my students know who this person was that did this, or who's Adams. So they sent me that, and of course I let him know then who's Adams.
How big was that book?
It's about that big.
About 1,000 pages?
800 and some pages, I think. It's heavy.
it was a piece of work.
It's real heavy stuff.
Yeah.
And one problem was that I intended it to be both a reference book and a senior level course or advanced level course textbook. And one publisher would say, "Oh, we publish textbooks, this is a reference book." The next one would say, "We publish reference books, this is a textbook." And this kept going back and forth till I hit Island Press. So that was state. Finally, I got tired of the whole mess and quit. And came down here where I can fiddle around on some land that we own up the country, woodland. Got a freshwater pond in the backyard, the ocean 3/10 of a mile away. Nothing to do. Nothing to do except on Wednesday I work at the Cape Fear Museum doing the same kinds of things that I was doing at the State Museum. On Thursday, I carve. This is one of my carvings here. And the rest of the time I do chores and play around in the woods. One sort of interesting thing relating to our land is that my wife's family, the estate goes back to the 1890s or so up in Bladen County. And in the early 90s, we acquired another 500 acres contiguous with it from the International Paper. And I got interested in researching the interaction of land use and land ownership on these lands. And I started tracing, and I traced this and traced that. And I started finding artifacts. And the artifacts got identified as colonial. Things got more interesting and more interesting as time went on. And to make a too long story not short enough, it turned out that we had purchased part of the plantation that was once owned by Colonel William Bartram, and on which his nephew, Billy Bartram, the naturalist, stayed. And I found some artifacts up there which I'm convinced probably were brought there by young Billy The drainage system that's now on the land, I'm convinced, was part of Bartram's drainage system. There are cypress trees 6 feet across inside the ditches, and cypress grows fairly slow, so I'm pretty well sure that we're now farming for wildlife, those areas that the Bartrams once farmed for a living.
It's interesting.
So here I am, and I talk too much, and that's the end.
Well, you're involved in some other things too, aren't you? Involved in some land trust work?
Well, yeah, I have been on the Coastal Land Trust Board of Directors.
That's a pretty important operation.
Well, it is, and you get me started again, Bob, you'll be here all night.
That's all right.
The concept of acquiring development rights over land as a means of preserving their, not wilderness, but somewhat natural conditions, is a fairly new one, maybe a decade or two old, but it's been gaining quite a lot of popularity. And the idea being that you can assure a landowner that whatever he or she is doing with the land now and wants it to be will be retained forever. And those rights can either be donated or they can be purchased. And with the Clean Water Management Trust Fund in North Carolina, many of them are being purchased. We donated quite a bit of land up here that we had before the money became available.
Mm-hmm.
Missed out on that one. But the Coastal Land Trust has been in operation, I think, 10 years. It's got something like 26,000 acres now under some sort of protection. The forestry fraternity initially fought this concept pretty strong, and feeling that this was more outside meddling and foresters knows best kind of business.
Yep.
But I think many of them have now come around where. So I worked on that for 6 years, I guess, and because in the early stages they were a little short on staff, and because I'd had a little experience in the field, I ended up doing some of the field reconnaissance work and then going on up and approving it as is that a bias or a conflict or something? Did you put that?
I have no question.
Well, Dave, you've really had a most varied career. Really interesting. I'm just wondering, one kind of final question. What were your most rewarding accomplishments or thing that you did that you got the most satisfaction out of?
That's a hard one to answer.
I know that.
Because all of these were so valuable to me that I learned so much. I think I was able to do a little good sometimes along the line. The book certainly was a major accomplishment. That was years of work, and it is a little different from most natural resource books in that I not only talk about the wildlife and the forestry, but I talk about land law. I talk about water resource development, coastal zone management, those kinds of things. I spent quite a bit of time on Justinian and Magna Carta, which of course are completely irrelevant these days, except that there was this little case down here between North Carolina and South Carolina. If one looks at the last Geologic Survey quad sheets, the state boundary runs through New River Inlet down there, except that it doesn't. The Lord in His wisdom has pushed that inlet westward to where Bird Island extends over the boundary quite a bit, which didn't make any difference until the Corps decided that they would jetty that inlet, and so they were paying big money for rights to use the land. And the North Carolina landowner claimed ownership because of accretion of his land across. Out of the woodwork came a South Carolina owner who claimed that way back in the teens that inlet was in South Carolina, and his predecessor had entered 18 acres in North Carolina, so he owned it. Well, the case went to trial in Horry County, South Carolina, so you can sort of figure which way this might go. And the judge found for the South Carolinian based upon the Justinian Code. he went back to the Justinian Code. There are two concepts of ownership of littoral land. One is under movable boundaries, erosion and accretion, which we normally use. The other is under fixed boundaries, where somehow or other there is a boundary involved that cannot be moved. In this case, it was the state line. Now, the North Carolina owner never owned land in South Carolina, so he could not have owned land across there. And this predecessor in title in South Carolina, good. But when I read the case, it just didn't, the translation of the code didn't sound right. And I went back and compared it to what I had used, and it was entirely different. So I wrote the good judge, Judge Bell in South Carolina, and said, read this thing, and I used Scott's translation and some work that I've been doing, and yours sounds different. You know, I said, what translation did you use? Judge Bell wrote back and said, I used my translation. Said, you got to watch that feller Scott. Said he doesn't know his Latin very well. Scott had translated the whole code and all books about that thick. I says, thank you, sir. And I guess picking up Pat somewhere along the line was an accomplishment.
Yeah.
We've had almost 50 years now. And that was another happen. So it surely wasn't by design that I met. Yeah, well, this is how it happened. Tom remembers Aubrey Shaw, who was a classmate of mine at State. After I graduated from school, went down and lived with Aubrey for a while, and we got tired of his cooking. He mentioned that he had a cousin down in Kelly that was a real good cook, and we ought to go down and visit her about dinner time, and we did. And that's my wife Pat. So there's nothing.
I know how you got married.
How was that?
You used to fly that little airplane all kinds of times, day and night, everywhere, regardless of the weather. And you'd fly in to see Pat, weekends, nights, days, weekends, good weather, bad weather. She got worried about you going to kill yourself in that plane. And so to stop you flying in there and risking your life, she said, I'll just marry you.
She did. She gave me a choice. I could have the plane or I could have her, but I couldn't have both.
I knew that.
And you made a good choice.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. It's lasted longer than the plane, for sure.
I'd like to tell one other story. Can I tell one other story? I have a whole bunch of them I wanted to tell you, but I'll tell one. We had that course in advanced ornithology at State, which meant you took a bunch of old renegades like you, advanced graduate students, out hunting and identify birds at the end of a gun barrel. And we shot all day down at Belhaven region at Alva's house. And come sundown, in our outdoor clothes and hip boots, we went up to the next county to get a sip of beer. Hyde County was dry. And after a while, we went on back to Alva's house and spent the night. And getting out of the truck, you fell into that ditch alongside the road into that water. And somebody said, oh my, Dave must have had too much to drink. And I said, no, he didn't. No, he didn't. He's trying to learn how to walk on water, because to be assistant secretary of natural resources, you have to know how to walk on water. I defended you.
Tom, the water in Hyde County does not obey the laws of physics. That ditch came right up and hit me in the face.
I remember. I saw you do it. I saw it do it to you.
I tell you one thing, he can take the canoe or what do you call the other thing? Kayak, and paddle around the marsh and shoot marsh ants better than anybody I ever saw.
He shot the ones I was aiming to shoot one day on a field trip. I should have given an F, but I gave him an A anyhow.
Well, Dave,
Enough.
we could go on.
We'll probably go on for another couple or 3 hours off camera.
You've had a most interesting career, and I think one that's been real important for conservation and wildlife. Well, all of us owe you a debt of gratitude for the work you've done, and we appreciate you telling them about it.
It's been a wonderful career, and it's been wonderful people along the way that have helped with it.
That's always one of the most rewarding things, isn't it? Okay, well, thanks a lot, and just keep going.
Okay, Bob. Tom?
Good to be here. Any Pearl said,
Well, Dave, we're back for just a few more minutes. Tell us about a couple other interesting things that happened.
You didn't give me time enough, Bob. You cut me off there before I got through.
We're giving you more time.
Oh, all right. Okay. Well, there was a couple things that happened while I was on the staff of the Marine Science Council, and another incident down here with Little Wildlife Management that I thought might be interesting.
Okay.
I mentioned that for several years I was on the President's Commission on Marine Science, Engineering, and Resources.
Right.
And toward the end of that tenure, the commission was about through, the reports had been written, and I was still Fisheries Commissioner in North Carolina. And I was at a meeting out at the faculty club one day, and the telephone rang, and I got paged. Now this is to illustrate how green, naive, and stupid that I really was. The telephone rang, I got paged, went to the telephone, and the voice on the other side said, "This is Ed Wink at the White House." Now you'd have thought I'd have known what the White House was. But I said, "Any particular White House?" And he said, "The White House." Well, then I began to get the picture, that he really meant that place up there in D.C. And he talked on and he said, "We're looking for somebody to serve on the Marine Science Council staff." Now, the council was an in-house comparable group to the commission, which was out-of-house. So the council consisted of representatives, generally at the assistant secretary level, of about 18 different federal agencies. He said, "We're looking for somebody to represent on the council the coastal zone area, and because you've had some experience in that, said, we thought you might know somebody that you could recommend that would fill that job." So old stupid Dave jumps right in and says, "Now, do you mean Dave Adams or do you mean somebody else?" And he hired me. After starting like that, he hired me. So I went to work then on staff of the Marine Science Council for about a year before the council expired by statute. But during that tenure, the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act was in the Congress. And that was one of the products of the commission, really. And we had been working with Senator Magnuson on this bill. There were 2 senators and two representatives, 2 congressmen on the commission itself, and he was one of the senators. Lennon was one of the congressmen. And we've been working with Magnuson's staff, and I get this call from our contact with the Bureau of the Budget. It's now Office of Management and Budget, but it was the agency which cleared all administration statements before the Congress. You just didn't say anything representing the administration unless you got cleared by BOB. So I get this call from our contact with BOB, and he said, "Dave, have you seen this bill of Magnuson's?" And I said, "Yeah." I didn't tell him we'd worked on it. I just told him we'd seen it. And he said, well, what do you think of it?" And I said, "Well, we've been kicking this thing around for 5 or 6 years now, and we aren't going to know what works until we try something. And it's a pretty good bill. I think we ought to go with it." And there was just absolute silence on the other end. I said, "Whoever your name is, no. Are you still there?" After a little while, reply came back, "That's too bad." Now, what in the world? What's too bad? He's got a good bill. He's in the wrong party. Now, dumb Dave had no idea that party was going to make any difference in something like this. But this was the Nixon administration, and they had their own policy coming in. And until it got all cleared, which was about 2 months later, and they got their bill in, then there could be no administration witnesses in favor of this bill. So I missed the whole works on that one. That was one that we missed. The other one was the Great Cormorant Caper. And I have to mention this because John Heisterberg, who's here running the camera, was one of the actors in this little show. He doesn't remember it, but it was so. Just as the fellow that I was talking with from BOB doesn't remember that conversation either, but I know it was, and I know who he was. But anyway, back to the Cormorant Caper. For years, we live on the edge of the mainland, adjacent to the estuary here. And in our backyard is a sinkhole pond of 6 or 8 acres. For years there was a high-level power line going across from the mainland to Figure 8 Island, Figure 8 Beach here. And the cormorants thought that was just a wonderful place to spend the night. And they would flock into there a wing spread apart, or maybe 2 wing spreads apart, all along that 1,000 feet or so of 3 or 4 lines. Hundreds or maybe even thousands of cormorants, just solid cormorants across there. And they liked it real well, but really not doing any